Welcome back to Coding for Real with Neil. I'm your host, and my name, of course, is Neil. This is PHP for Real, where we're taking a look at PHP and we're applying it to real-world scenarios, and we're trying to explain it using real-world objects and world things. This lesson is Forms Part 3, where we're going to be taking a deeper look at form validation and how it works with PHP. And we're going to be having a look at how to make forms have required fields, just like you would in HTML when you use the required keyword. Now, this is a follow-on from the last lesson, so I'm going to use the same analogy, and that is the one of the security guard. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please watch, it'll probably pop up over here. Please watch the video that's about to pop up so that you understand what I'm talking about when I say the security guard. There is quite a bit of information to cover in this lecture, so I won't keep you. So without further ado, let's get into the information. Alrighty, so welcome to the lesson. Now, if you did watch the last video, then you'll recognize this form. This is exactly the same form that we built in the last lesson. All I've done is I've deleted the PHP at the top, which was the lesson notes, just the three things we're going to be learning, and I've added in a part 2 here. The rest of this is exactly the same, just so that we don't have to create another form. But just to remind you, let me show you what this looks like in the browser. So here we are over in the browser. As you can see, this is lesson 15, not lesson 14 anymore, and we've just got this very simple form here. And this is being validated using the HTML special characters function wrapped around the entire form to stop against cross-site scripting attacks. But what we can do is we can take this one step further and we can validate each field separately. Let's take a look at how to do that. So the first thing we need to do is we need to open and close our PHP tags. So let's open and close some PHP tags at the top here. Okay, now, because we want to be capturing each of these fields separately, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to assign each of them to a variable. You know how to do that. So first, let's create a variable and call it name. Let's not set anything yet. Then we're going to create a variable and call that email. I think it was email. Yes. And then we're going to create another variable and call it gender. Just like that. We've created 3 variables. Then what we need to do is we need to assign whatever the user inputs into each of these 3 fields using the method that the form is being submitted with. It is being submitted using the post method. So we need to, whatever method is being used, we need to make sure that we extract that information out and assign it into these variables. How do we do that? Well, the first thing that we need to do is let's set these initially to empty strings. So we just set that equal to, and then put in just the inverted commas so that it's setting it to an empty string. Then what we need to do is we need to use an if statement. So you know about if statements. So you open and close the parentheses and you open and close the curly brackets. Then in here, inside of the parentheses, is where you are going to dictate the submission method that is on the form. In this case, it is post. So the first thing we do is we use a super global called server, which you know about. If not, please watch the video that's about to pop up. Then in here, we would use, remember, based on what information we put into the square brackets, determines what information is returned by server. So what you're doing here is you're saying you're using the server super global, which returns an associative array, and the information that you want to extract out is the request method. Then you are very simply setting that equal to, remember the double equals, and you're going to set that equal to post. So what this is saying is if the server request method is post, it reads pretty logically. If server request method is equal to post, then what do we want to do? Then we want to assign each user input into its associated variable. So if the request method used on this form was get, this would return false. So none of the information inside of these curly brackets would execute, right? Because it's only going to perform the action that's inside of the curly brackets if the condition inside of the if statement returns true. So in this case, if the form method is post. So inside here, we want to assign each of the user inputs, so what they've put in, associated with the name, we want to assign it to the appropriate variable. So to do that, we would simply use the variable and we would set it equal to post. Now inside of here, we would put name. So this name here, what you've got to realize is this post super global returns an associative array of variables passed to the current script. So to access the key of this associative array, you put it inside square brackets, and then the key would be the name of whatever the information is within this associative array, and then it would assign the value based on the key you put in here. It would assign the value to the name variable. This key here, how do you know what that is? Well, this is why you use the name for your form input sections. So the name that is assigned to the name parameter of this input field, this is the key. So for the first one, we want to pull out whatever, because when this gets sent, so when someone puts their name in and it gets sent to the associative array that is going to be found with the post method, it's going to have name equals whatever they input. And then the second one, it's going to have email, whatever they input. This is why we use name. The name is giving the actual user input a name. So this is what you want to pull out, is the name. So the first one is name. The second one is exactly the same. However, we change this to email because it's a different variable. It's the email variable. And we assign that to email because the name of this one is email. So whatever the associative array's key of email is, as specified by the user, assign it to email. And then the last one is the radio. Remember, radio is one out of all of them. You can't select more than one. It's one selection only. And that is exactly the same. You would do gender is equal to post. And then in here, you would put gender. Let's just double check that that is the correct name. Name, because they all have the same name, because they are all part of the same radio selection group. So that is how you would set all the user inputs to be equal to a variable. All right, now if we want to test this out, let's put underneath here, let's put in some PHP tags. Just like that. And let's echo out the name, because that is now a variable. Okay, then we echo out a break, and then we are also underneath here, we are underneath the email. Let's echo out the email just to check that these fields are working. But underneath the radio input of gender, we are going to echo out the gender. This is just to check that all of these variables are working. So what it's going to do is the post method that is put in by the user is going to store it into the name variable, and then we're just going to echo out whatever that name variable is once it's been submitted by the user. So we're just going to email out each of these underneath its appropriate section so that we can check that these three variables are working. So this in the browser looks like. Here we are over, and you can see it's already put spaces in there, but there's nothing put in yet. So if I put in my name, if I put in my email and I put mail, and then I don't have a submit button, input type submit value submit. So let me put that submit button in first. Okay, so over in the browser, what we do is we put in name, email, and mail, and it returns nothing. So we've made a small error somewhere. Let's go and figure out where. Okay, so back over here, we've got our opening and closing PHP tags. We're good. Simple variable, that is fine. And then we've got the if server request. That's why this is request underscore method. My apologies there, guys. Make sure you do put request underscore method is equal to post. It's not space. Let's go back to the browser and check. Back in the browser, we refresh. Now you can see that it's echoing all of the information out here. So we put in me, we put in email, we put in mail, and we hit submit. Not echoing out. There it is. It's echoing it out there. Not on the line after, but that's okay. There we are. So all the variables are working. All right, now we have our form working and we are assigning each of the user input data fields to their own variables. What do we do now? Well, the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to get rid of any white space and any special characters that people would want to put in here. Luckily, PHP has a built-in function for that. So because we've got more than one field, we're going to want to do them all at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a function here. And we're going to call this function tidy inputs. We open and close the parentheses, we open and close the curly brackets. Now, what do we want to do in here? Well, PHP, so in here, we want to do multiple things, but we're going to do them one at a time. The first thing we want to do is we want to clear out all of the white space and all of the special characters. PHP has a built-in function called trim, just like that. And what trim does, it'll trim the string, exactly as it says here. So it's going to trim out any white space and any special characters. But as you can see, that's not going to work here. So what we would do is we would pass in here name, for example, and then we would say name equals trim name. Okay. So now it's actually going to assign the trimmed version of name to a new variable. Let's call this trimmed name. What this function is doing is it's tidying the inputs. It does need to take in a parameter. The parameter it's going to take in is name. And then we are simply trimming the name variable and assigning it to a new variable called trimmed name. And it's going to contain the same information that name contains, just trimmed. But as you can see, this name is in dark blue because this trimmed variable, it's declared, but it's not used yet. But before we go any further, there is a better way of doing this. Because we want to use all three of these, doing this, we'd have to make a new function for each of these. So we'd have to do one for, so we'd probably call this tidy name. Then we'd have to do tidy email as a new function. So there is a better way of doing this. Let's put in here input. Okay. Then over here, let's put in input. And then here we put in input. Just like that. So what we're now doing is we're passing in an input, okay? And then we are reassigning the trimmed version of that input into the input variable. But then we need to call this function for it to work, right? Bear with me here. We're passing in an input into the tidy inputs function. Once whatever input gets passed in, so whether it's name, so if we pass in name, so what we could do is we could call this down here. We could call tidy inputs, right? And then we could pass in name if we wanted to. Then we could call it again and we could input email, right? So we're passing in each of these one by one, and then we're trimming the input and we're reassigning it to the input variable. But then we need to use this input variable. So there's a much easier way of doing this. What we do, because we're already assigning it, is we can go up here and we can wrap each of these, right? We could wrap each of these in a tidy inputs function, okay? Tidy inputs, like that. And then we could also do it here with a tidy inputs. So now what we're doing is when we assign the variable, when we assign the user inputted data that's put through post, we're assigning it to name, but we're trimming it first. So what it's going to do is it's going to capture the name that someone puts in. So they put in my name. So it's then going to come down here and it's going to go, okay, cool. I'm taking that name, I'm passing it into the tidy inputs function. Tidy inputs function, okay, it's trimming whatever this input is, it's trimming it, and it's outlaying it as the input, and then it's assigning the input as whatever has been passed in, which is exactly what the data was. So essentially, it's automatically trimming every single time someone puts their name in, and then it's assigning it to name. So this is what we're going to do. And now, because we've set this function up, we can expand this and we can put in other things. Okay, so the next thing we could do is we could take the same input and then in the same instance, so every single time it takes the user input, it's going to be going through this tidy inputs function. So what else do we want to do in here? Well, what other PHP functions are there? You wouldn't know. Well, let me tell you about another one that's really handy. Another one that's really handy is what's called trim slashes. And then again in here, we would put in input. And so what this is going to do is this is also going to take out any, so a string with backslashes stripped off. So double backslashes are made into single backslashes are completely stripped off. So that's what strip slashes is going to do. And then what else we could do, you already know about this one, is we could do HTML special characters and put in here the input as well. So as soon as the user inputs their name, it's going to run all three of these. It's going to trim whatever data the user put in. It's going to strip any slashes from the data the user puts in, and it's going to remove any HTML special characters. Remember about the HTML entities? All in one. And then once it's run all three of these, it's going to assign it to the variable that we've set up. But there is one thing we need to do first, because as it sits right now, all it's doing is it's doing this, and then the data is sitting there. It's not actually doing anything. So what we do need to do is we need to return the input. And once it returns the input, it's going to be sitting in here. Then it's going to assign it to the appropriate variable. And now we've set up a really secure way of validating data and avoiding any malicious code from being put in. The good thing about this is that it's expandable. We can add in any other security measures we want to into this tidy inputs function. And that's just what I've called it. You can call it anything. And the other thing that this is we're avoiding dry. And dry means don't repeat yourself. So rather than have all of these split into separate functions, it would take up a lot more lines of code because we need to do each one for name, then each one for email. We've set it up and we've set it up into one easy function so that we're not repeating ourselves. Now let's check that our input still works in the browser. All right, here we are. Let me put in my name. Let me put in my email. Let me tick mail and hit submit. And there we are. The information is still being pulled through, but this time it has all of those security measures included. That is fantastic. We've got this security feature implemented now, but the problem is that these are still optional. All of these are still optional. Someone doesn't have to put in a name. Someone doesn't have to put in an email. They don't have to choose a gender. That's what we're going to be looking at now, is how to make sure that user has to put this information in. So we're essentially doing the required, but we're doing it through PHP in a much more secure way. So how do we go about doing this? So the first thing we need to do is we need to set up 3 more variables. And the first variable we're going to set up is, let's call this name required. And let's set it to an empty string just like above. And then we are going to set up, you guessed it, an email required. And we're going to set that to an empty string. And then you guessed it, we are going to set up one called gender required. And you would set this up for any data field that would be required for the user to put it in. Now we need to get some information in here. What are we going to do once we have set up these empty variables with the required attached onto the end? Well, the beautiful thing is that PHP has another handy built-in function. And that built-in function is called empty. And you can pass variables and data into the empty function. The function's name is empty. And if the information you pass in is in fact empty, then it will return an error, or it will return something that you designate. So you'd use this in an if-else statement. Let's go through an example. So we'd come down to this if statement here, and this if statement here is returning all of the data that's been passed into the server superglobal via the post method. So this is only getting filled out once the user submits the information. So once they hit the submit button. So this would be a good place to put these required variables in here. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to put in an if statement. We're going to open and close the parentheses and then open and close the curly brackets. Then inside here, we are going to use the PHP function called empty. We're going to open and close parentheses. And then inside here, we are going to use the superglobal post. And you guessed it, we are going to pass in name just like we've done down here. If this, so if the post superglobal name field returns empty, what do you want to do? You want to display an error message, okay? Or else, so if it doesn't return empty, you want that, right? So you want the name, so you want all of this. So you want the data that's put, so if it doesn't return empty, you want all the data that's put in it to be assigned to the name variable. And here is Sky, come to say hello. Hello, Sky. So let's set up another one because we're going to also need one for post. Oops, that is the wrong brackets. Square brackets. Email. Then we open and close that. We put in an else. And inside here, we want to put in that. And then we're going to set up one more for, you guessed it, gender. And then inside here, we're going to put an else. And then inside the else, we are going to put in that. Okay, so here we have it set up. It's set up exactly how it was, okay? We're going to display an error message on all of them. So let me just put that in there. And let me put that in there as well. So right now we've got it set up exactly as it was, where if the data field returns empty, it's doing absolutely nothing. If it's not returning empty, so else, anything other than empty, it's assigning it to gender. So what do we do from here? So from here, we want to echo out, so if the data field returns empty, we very simply want to, we have it up here, use the name required variable, right? Display the name required variable. And then here we want to display the email required variable. And then down here, we want to use the gender required variable. Amazing. Hi, Sky. Hi. And then simply from here, Sky is now sitting on my mouse. And then simply from here, we just want to assign this a value. And we assign this as name is required, just like that. And then same for email. Email is required. And I need to go down. Sorry, Sky is sitting on my mouse. Gender is required, just like that. So you may be asking, why am I not just using one error message? Well, you could, but then you wouldn't have the ability of using this name, right? So the reason I've used a different variable for each field is because then I can set each variable to a different message. What you could do is you could just have up the top, you could have a variable called message, right? And then each time in here, you could just set that to field is required, like that, right? And then you'll just copy and paste that down to each one of these and you'd have the same message. But this way, we're having it a little bit more refined and we're having a separate message for each one. Okay, and that is how you would use the empty method, and you would have error messages displaying if a user does not input data into the field in the form. But that's not going to display just yet because we're not really doing anything with this. All we're doing is we're setting up the condition of what's going to happen if they do put in a name or they don't put in a name. Last but not least, we need to have this message displayed when the user puts information in or not, right? And we would do that down on the form. So down here where we were echoing the name, we could just replace this with name required. Then we could replace this with email required, and we could replace this with gender required, because we won't need to be echoing out their name and their email. That's going to be going externally, and then we'll maybe echo a welcome message when they log in, something like that. So we will be echoing out the error message that's going to pop up when they don't put in a name or they don't put in an email. That makes more sense than echoing out their name. So let's go and have a look in the browser. Here we are over on the form. We refresh. Name is required, email is required, gender is required. Okay, so I'm not going to put in a name. I'm going to put in my email. I'm going to tick mail, submit. Perfect. So we only get name is required. This time I'm going to put in my name. I'm not going to put in an email. I'm going to put in mail. We submit. It says email is required only. And you could style this and make this red. You know how to do that with CSS. So this time I'm going to put in my name. I'm going to put in an email, and I'm not going to tick a gender. And it says gender is required. Our form is now fully validated using that security method we set up, the tidy inputs function that we set up. That's the security. And we also have error messages displaying now if an input field is not filled out by the user. So this form is now validating all of the information, and we have required set up. All right, guys, congratulations on making it to the end of this lesson. This lesson, you would have learned a lot more about validation, about validating forms in PHP, and you would have learned how to implement the required field. If you know the required keyword in HTML, you now know how to implement that in PHP. You also would have learned a little bit more about how security works and how to secure the information that's being put in by the user, and how to prevent against different kinds of attacks that malicious actors could do on the information on your website, on your database, that kind of thing, by using trim, by using HTML special characters, and by using strip slashes built-in functions. In the next lesson we're going to be carrying on again, and we're going to be learning how to validate email addresses to make sure that it is actually an email address that has been put in. And we're also going to learn how to validate URLs so that the form will automatically know if it is a valid URL that the user has put in. So that's a really exciting lesson. So I really can't wait to share that information with you guys, and I'll see you then. Bye for now.